touch of your hand makes my pulse react. That it's only the thrill of boy meeting girl, opposites attract. It's physical, only logical. You must try to ignore that it means more than that. Oh, what's love got to do with it? What's love but a second-hand emotion? What's love got to do with it? Who needs a heart when a heart can be broken? It may seem to you that I'm acting confused.
Okay, welcome. Today we continue our examination of the social encyclicals with Benedict XVI's Caritas in Veritate. Okay, so as usual, we start with what was going on in the world at that time. And this was going on. The empire strikes out. And the problems of hegemony. We'll start here. The day the world changed.
It was 8:46 in the morning. That's when this stopped even resembling a normal day.
Right then and there, I knew that this was going to be the worst day of my life as a firefighter.
Indeed, it was the worst day that many of us had seen in a long time. And it led to endless war and financial collapse. You might call this the irony of triumph. Okay, the United States, you'll remember at the end of our last encyclical, Centesimus Annus, it dealt with the collapse of the Soviet Empire, which left the United States as the only world power. So we were the sole hegemon. This led to hubris and the triumph of the neoconservative. And they believed that with a little effort and some small wars, the end of history was in sight. Well, hubris, as it turns out, undoes an empire more than any other factor. See what happened. Unending war, because the belief was a few small wars would end all wars. So, after 9/11, Afghanistan, where the attack originated, and Saudi Arabia, where most of the attackers originated, these places were ignored. We had a small war in Afghanistan, but we really had another object in mind. Iraq, which had nothing to do with the attacks, but it had a rather nasty and unpopular dictator in control of it, Saddam Hussein. And the neoconservatives believed that the world was really waiting for Western liberal values. They were waiting for political freedom in the form of democracy, for economic freedom in the form of capitalism, and religious freedom in the form of liberalism. Or was it? Did they not have values and histories and political institutions and social arrangements of their own? Well, so why Iraq? Well, Iraq, though it had nothing to do with 9/11, was in the center of the Middle East. And it was believed if you could create this sort of Western democratic capitalistic liberal democracy in the middle of the Middle East, then the rest of the Middle East would follow suit because it would be so wonderful. Well, in place of peace, we've had endless war. And you always have to ask, when you see endless war, will it come home to us? Because the one inviolable rule of history is that what goes around comes around. Now, we also had the failure of free trade. Free trade was supposed to be this universal solution to poverty and development, but it was a total failure. The rich got richer, the poor got angry. Social divisions became wider than ever, and the world became more unstable. In truth, trade was only part of the problem. For example, automation meant you could have increased output with fewer workers and lower paid workers at that. Then we had the era of financial collapse. This followed the era of deregulation and lower taxes. This began with Reagan, but it continued right through Bill Clinton. Now, growth slowed in the late 90s, and industry had shrinking employment. Globalization, automation, things like that meant you needed fewer workers. However, the power of banks and insurance companies were growing, and the banks were deregulated in 1999. This led to a speculative binge, and we'll see later just how crazy this binge was. And that led to a worldwide financial collapse in 2008. So the feeling was all over the world that capitalism could no longer deliver on its promises. All right, that brings us to Benedict XVI and Caritas in Veritate. And Caritas in Veritate asks that question raised by that great theologian, Tina Turner, what's love got to do with it? And that also answers the question everybody has since the opening music. Now, what is the date of this encyclical? Actually, it has two dates. It was issued in 2009, but internally, the date is 2007, and there's an interesting reason for that, as we'll see. All right, its major themes is the relationship between caritas and truth, and the interconnections between caritas, respect for life, respect for the environment, and authentic human development. And he introduces a rather startling principle, the principle of gratuitousness, which he means to apply to normal business and normal politics. And he develops the idea of integral human development, the one that began with Paul VI in Populorum Progressio. All right, because really this whole encyclical is rooted in the works of Pope Paul VI. It's a revival of his work. So it starts by a consideration of Populorum Progressio, which it says is the rerum novarum of our time. In other words, just as rerum novarum had started off sort of this great expansion of Catholic social thinking, reflection on social order and economics, now he's updating that to Populorum Progressio as the founding document for our period of history. Now, internally, it says that this document, Caritas in Veritate, comes 40 years after Populorum Progressio. Well, why is that? Well, it makes Caritas and Veritate serve as the 40º anno to Populorum Progressio. So just as 40º anno sort of enriched the teaching of Rerum Novarum, this is meant to serve the same function for Populorum Progressio, the new Rerum Novarum. But he goes a step further. He connects development with Humanae Vitae. Now that's a surprising move. So he ties all of the works of Paul VI together. And he connects respect for life with development and with the environment. So this is a grand synthesis of the work of Pope Paul VI. He starts with a consideration of the connection between caritas and truth. Caritas, he says, is at the heart of Catholic social teaching. Now, I want to point something out here. Caritas is usually translated as charity, and in the summary that you have, the word is translated as charity. However, I left the word in its Latin form, caritas, and I did that for a very specific reason. In my opinion, charity has become somewhat of a corrupt term in English. Charity can just mean, writing a check to your favorite philanthropist. Well, then that's fine, but that's not charity. That, at best, that's philanthropy. Caritas is love given and received. That is, it's two ways. Benedict insists that caritas is not just a principle of personal relations, that is, micro relations, but also of international relations, macro relations, relations on the grandest scale. However, he says, without truth, caritas gets emptied of meaning. That is, it can't just be a warm feeling, It has to be connected with real study. It has to be connected with real research. It has to be connected with intelligent efforts, etc. Truth, he says, is logos, which is communicated. It is a dialogos. So truth, like caritas, is kind of interactive, right? It's a dialogue. And I believe that this course is designed on that same principle. So the truth here is not one direction. It's a conversation that we're having. Well, truth enables us to transcend mere opinion and cultural limitations. So without truth, social action ends up just serving private interests and the logic of power. So we already talked about that earlier, in fact, when we talked about the Oxford and Heidelberg model and how we got the Heidelberg model because Andrew Carnegie would only fund the Heidelberg model. You see, there was a lot of social action on Carnegie's part, but it all had to be his way. So, justice, caritas, and the common good. Justice, he says, is not optional. Every society embodies a system of justice. So, if you're in a slave society, well, then obviously they believe it's just that some people are masters and some people are slaves. So, justice isn't optional. It's but the political system, the economic system, they embody some notion of justice. Now, these notions, however, can be right or wrong, good or bad. Caritas, however, goes beyond justice. With Caritas, I give out of love what is mine. But before I can do that, I must first give to the other what is his. That's justice. So the first requirement of Caritas is justice. That is, you can't even talk about Caritas until you've fulfilled the requirements of justice. Now look how far we've come. In Leo the 13th, you had Caritas here and justice there, and they didn't meet. Okay, but here Benedict makes justice the basis of Caritas. So you can't even talk about Caritas. You can't even talk about being charitable until you've first fulfilled the requirements of justice. Caritas, he says, completes and transcends justice in the logic of giving and forgiving. It involves a commitment to the common good. Without that, you can have neither Caritas nor justice. And it is the institutional, that is the political way of Caritas. When Caritas replaces justice, when charity displaces justice, you have problems. So charity cannot be a substitute for justice. Remember, in the 19th century, the 18th century, all of these problems were reduced to charity. They didn't really think about system. And I'll give you an example. This is not in the encyclical. This is my example. So you've heard of Tom's shoes. You know, buy one, give one. You buy a pair of shoes from us, and we'll give some shoes to some needy person in some undeveloped country. However, Tom's shoes are made in sweatshops. Now, Africans know how to make shoes, and so do Haitians, so do people in India, everybody, South America, everybody knows how to make shoes. They don't need Tom to teach them. But Tom's shipments of free shoes destroys local markets because nobody can compete with free. Well, you destroy the market, and that requires more charity. So charities often do more harm than good. Why? Because we think of them as one way. You know, we're just doing something for these poor people. And so they are divorced from notions of truth and justice. So instead of establishing justice in these, or contributing to justice in these places, we're just going to do nice things for them. We don't have to think about it. We only have that warm feeling that comes from, you know, buying a pair of Tom's shoes. Okay, get back to the. Now he talks about integral human development. Again, this actually comes from Paul VI. So development cannot be the mere accumulation of wealth. It must concern the whole person. And this requires a transcendent view of the human person. And we must take responsibility, personal responsibility. We must reform institutions, but reforming of institutions is not enough. Hence, development depends on freedom. And our notions of freedom must come from the gospel, because it's in the gospel where we learn how to build freedom and justice. Then he takes it a step further, and he makes a connection between life ethics, as found in Humane Vitae, and social ethics. Because everything comes down to the importance of the family. All right, development and the common good. Now, development, he says, demands a respect for truth. We must promote the good of every man and the whole man. So not just his economic development, but his social, political, family development, the community. But when God is eclipsed, we fail to recognize even the natural order. And lack of development, he says, is equal to a lack of brotherhood. Let me go back to the previous point. When we talk just about development, and apart from everything else, the natural order just becomes a place where we can extract something, extract natural resources. And so we abuse nature to get as much as we can out of it. Now, reason, he says, can establish the need for equality, but it cannot establish brotherhood. So there is an urgent need for reform. Our current problems. It starts with this. It starts with making everything subordinate to profit. Now, you have to understand, he's not talking against profits. Profits are useful as a means to an end. And in fact, without making a profit, you cannot tell whether you are correctly allocating resources, correctly producing a product that somebody wants, or providing a service that somebody wants. Profit is sort of your measuring stick that you're doing all of this. But it's still a means to an end. It's not, it cannot be an end in itself. Because as an end in itself, it destroys wealth and creates poverty. So there are a series of malfunctions that it produces. Wealth is growing, but so are inequalities. You get unregulated exploitation of the earth's resources. And what is the result? Well, it's back to the future. It's back to the conditions that prevailed in the late 19th and early 20th century. So look at these charts. These come from Thomas Piketty's Capital et Idéologie. Look at this chart. Let me point this out. This is income equality in the United States and Europe from 1900 to 2015. This first chart here is the share of income that goes to the top 10%. Notice that at the start of the 20th century, it reached a point where 50% of the income was going to the top 10%. Now this declined under the New Deal and the social democracies, both in the United States and Europe. But look what happened after the 1980s. This rose again and is now at levels that preceded World War I. In Europe, the rise hasn't been as great, and it has moderated in the last 10 years. But in the United States, this inequality continues to grow. It's even a little bit worse when you look at just the top 1%. Again, here's the United States. The top 1%, all by itself, gets 20% of the national income. And that compares with, what is this, about 8% in Sweden, and the worst is Great Britain, about 14%. But here's the share of property, the share of wealth that's owned here by the top 10%. Well, look, in 1900 in the United States, that was 80%. And we were better than Britain, where it was 92, 93%. And then it declined all the way down till the 1980s. But in the 1980s, again, this was reversed. And now we're back up to the point where this top 10% owns what looks like about 74% of the stock, the real estate, all of the wealth of the United States mostly is in the hands of this top 1%. But it gets even worse. This is the top 1%. So even just being in the top 10% doesn't get you that much. The top 1% owns close to 40% of all the wealth in the United States. I would say that that is an unsustainable situation. It destabilizes the world, it destabilizes the nation. And I think it does a lot to explain the kind of politics that we have today. Well, this is Back to the Future. Will it have the same result? And we have new forms of poverty. We have the growth of corruption and illegality all over the world, except in the United States. In the United States, there's no political corruption. Why? Well, because we've legalized just about every form of corruption there could be. Also leads to mass migration. When we destroy other countries, people, either both economically and environmentally, people have no choice but to go where the money is. What is required, Benedict says, is a new humanistic synthesis. Now, this is a loaded term. When he says a humanistic synthesis, well, others would have preferred to say a religious synthesis. But in a pluralistic world, I think talking about a humanistic synthesis is far more useful, far more practical, because the humanistic synthesis, the human always involved religious. All right, you also get the shrinking state. States have lost their sovereignty in the face of global finance and production. I mean, lots of corporations are larger than most states. They have bigger budgets than most. But combined with the power of the hegemon, like the United States, okay, these states really have very little control over their own affairs. They cannot pursue social justice in an environment that searches always for the lowest cost. And they are at the mercy of these more powerful countries. So they have very, very little control of their own affairs. So we demanded and got that social security systems in these countries were downsized, which of course increased the instability. However, Benedict says, man is the primary capital to be safeguarded and valued. So remember John Paul II's talk about the priority of labor over capital. And here he's repeating that by saying, man is the primary capital, not physical capital. But labor has lost its bargaining power. Now, interestingly, after in the pandemic, labor seems to be regaining some of its bargaining power. All right. So, development and culture. We kind of enter this period of cultural eclecticism. Culture has become relativized. Culture has become the ethnic foods aisle in Tom Thumb. Pick one from here, one from there. So there's this cultural leveling. Oh, all cultures are equal. But that means there's a lack of real dialogue. So you can't have the cultural conversation. Because, oh, everything's equal, everything's has as much or as little a value as any other culture. Well, in fact, this simply isn't true. Each culture does something well and something badly. And it's only by a real cultural dialogue that we can both give and receive from other cultures. It all collapses into relativism. Since everything's equal, everything's relative, there's no real truth that any culture has to offer us. And culture gets divorced from human nature to become just another a commodity. Wealth and profit become the only secure values. So the need for Caritas. Now, all social action, he says, requires a doctrine. Okay? Well, this requires knowledge. So knowledge and Caritas cannot be things opposed. Rather, it's just the opposite. Caritas animates knowledge. Deeds without knowledge are blind, he says, and knowledge without love is sterile. So Caritas is not an added extra to reason and knowledge, but it's at the heart of the dialogue between reason and knowledge. So it is a practical requirement. Moral evaluation and scientific research go hand in hand. He introduces this rather startling principle, the principle of gratuitousness. He says the consumerist culture cannot recognize the logic of the gift, but it is the gift that is the basis of the human person. The human person is made for gift. In fact, the human person is made by gift. The gift of your parents to each other is the only reason that any of us are here in the first place. So it is gift that makes present the transcendent dimension of man. Now, markets work by commutative justice, and that's fine. But it relegates giving and receiving to a transaction, a price, if you will. But the social doctrine is about distributive and social justice, which are things that have been exiled from the study of current economics, neoliberal economics. Markets cannot produce social cohesion and trust. But without social cohesion and trust, markets cannot work because transaction costs would be too high. I mean, if you had to assume everybody's a thief, monitoring transactions would be too expensive. Without social cohesion, the market just becomes a place where the strong subdue the weak. It becomes the war of all against all. It becomes the place where the powerful who have pricing power, political power, can impose their will on everybody else. So the market and gift. So relations of solidarity and reciprocity must be conducted within commercial relationships. Within the market, there must be social ethics, the logic of the gift, and the principle of gratuitousness. Justice must be applied to every phase of economic activity. This requires contracts, absolutely. But it also requires just laws and forms of redistribution governed by politics. There's that word again, redistribution. The market distributes, but there must also be political redistribution because the market cannot by itself get it right, cannot provide. So we need institutional Caritas in the form of politics. So the marketing gift, gratuitousness, fraternal relations in commercial transactions. Without gratuitousness, without this idea that everything traces to a gift, we really can't have justice. So there must be room for commercial enterprises based on mutualism and pursuing social ends. And while not rejecting profit, we must pursue higher goals. Profit must be a means to an end, never, never an end in itself. So this requires a new understanding of business. Outsourcing, he says, weakens the connection with the country and the worker. So we don't even know who it is that makes our products, unless we take some time in the morning to look at the labels and see, who is dressing us, whose labor produced this clothing. We have no connection whatsoever. We cannot have a world that is connected only with the shareholding. Now, I want to add another thing here about market and gift. Let me say that when you make something, when you sell something, it also involves a gift. What do I mean? When you put your name on a product, you sell that product, and that the pay compensates, the price compensates. But in truth, the use value must exceed the exchange value. This is well known to economics. There must be something of yourself in that product. The product, yes, supports you, and from that you make your living, but it is also your gift to the world, something you provide that kind of bears your personality and carries it into the world. So it's not just a transaction. Certainly a transaction, but it's more than a transaction. It's also, in some sense, your gift to the world. All right. Rights, duties, and the environment. Rights presuppose duties, or they become mere license. Now, this challenges the current notion of rights, which are sort of abstract and disconnected from duties. In Catholic social teaching, rights arise from duties. A right is something you need to fulfill a duty. So, for example, fathers are required to support their families. Therefore, they have a right to a just wage. If they didn't have the duty, there wouldn't be the right. In a democracy, everyone's held responsible for the conduct of government. Therefore, you must have the right to vote. That right arises from your public duty, etc. But duties also set a limit on rights. So rights are not abstract and unending. All right, openness to life is a social and economic resource. That hides a lot there, because a lot of the problems, it was for a long time, and still believe that, you could solve the problem of poverty by getting rid of the poor, basically by having lots of free contraceptives. They cut down on the populations of Africa and India, etc., etc. Okay. Now, the economy requires ethics for its proper functioning. So it's not optional. It's not an extra. It's something at the heart of economic order. And throughout this course, we have tried to connect and will continue to connect equity and equilibrium. That is justice and just the simple balancing of supply and demand. And it must have a proper relationship with the environment. Now, you can neither endlessly exploit nature, because then you will destroy it, nor can you deify it. And the phrase is the tree hugger. You can't use trees at all because they're sacred, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So you can fall off on either side. All right. So this is the most sustained critique up to its time of capitalism as it actually exists. So what do you think? I think it's very, very challenging. So What kind of questions can we pose to it? Well, we can certainly pose this question. Can love really be connected with economic and political order? I mean, seriously? Is this just naive? Or is this just empty moralizing? It's fair to ask that question. Are Caritas, are love and justice really connected? Or is that just nice words? Can we really connect life ethics, that is, abortion and contraception, to environmental, political, social, and economic order? Right, well, I'll be interested in seeing what your answers are when we discuss this.
When you're close to me, yes, I tend to look dazed. I read it someplace. I've got cause to be. There's a name for it. There's a phrase that